This week, I'm going to take you on an adventure through the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Well, hey everybody, Hudson here. While you're watching this, I'm actually on this big grand road trip I've been really looking forward to through Yellowstone and the Tetons down to meet up with an amazing group of photographers for a workshop with my good friend Rick LePage in Moab. And so I was just thinking, the news has been kind of solemn this week. I've been seeing a lot of stuff about prepping to get drilling permits into the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and I got to say, it's been kind of bumming me out. It's a place that's really important to me. It's been a while now. I can't believe how time flies, but maybe 10, 15 years ago, I did a trip with two friends where we were dropped off in a small plane on the Arctic coastal plain near the Arctic Sea, and we crossed that coastal plain that's been such a contentious thing whether to open it or not, and did a traverse of the Brooks Range through the heart of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge on the Jago River and the Achillik River, and it was really one of the wildest places. It was the wildest place that I've ever been in my life. It is truly America's Serengeti without all the vehicles and people traversing it. And it was an adventure that was very formative for me. And before I got into photo education, one of the things I used to do was give a short slideshow of that trip. And I've never done it in a video. I've done it for the Sierra Club in multiple places, and for some National Geographic photographers in New York. And so it's a fun trip. I shot some film, I shot some digital. It was in my days of transition. I was carrying both formats, believe it or not, on that trip, and I thought I would just run through my slideshow, share it with you all while I'm off on this trip. I'll just do a quick narrated slideshow of that journey. All right, so looking back through my files, this trip was back in 2006, so it was about 13 years ago, and I had been on a trip climbing with a good friend of mine, Mike Collins, up in the Alaska range, where we did some first ascents with this legendary climber Fred Beckey a few years before this, and I really got along well with Mike, and he called me. It was about the time that Congress was seriously considering opening up the Arctic back in the George W. Bush administration, and he said, let's go check out the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge before they start drilling this place. It's supposed to be America's Serengeti. Let's go. It's wild. I've got this route I'd love to do and traverse the Brooks Range, get dropped off on one side, picked up on the other. And his son, Nathan, was graduating from college in construction engineering, and he thought it'd be kind of a cool father-son trip, but he'd like one more person. There's enough grizzlies out there, and just, it's rough wilderness, and he just thought it would be nice to have someone else that he could trust out there. So the three of us made plans, and we got transportation set up, and we flew up to Alaska with enough gear to last for about 2 weeks unsupported, backpacking over the Brooks Range. And for those of you that don't know where the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and I wish this map was a little higher resolution, but it still gives you a good idea. Here's Alaska, the Canadian Yukon's right up here. This is the Arctic Circle. And you've got the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge up here, just kind of hugging the northeastern section of Alaska. It's right up against Canada. Canada actually has a joint park that crosses over to this side, but we were focusing in on the Arctic, and we were going in right about here on the Arctic coastal plain. That's kind of the hot spot where they actually did recently authorize drilling, and they're looking at doing drilling contracts as we speak. And this was the route that we'd chosen. We land out here. We talked with this guy Kirk, who's kind of half Indiana Jones, half bush pilot, and he says he commonly dropped people off on a gravel bar near this little peak out on the coastal plain called Biddy. And if you take a look here, we've got the Arctic Sea right here. You're out along the Jago River. We started along this river. This is the Jago River. And we started up into the foothills of the Brooks Range and the Romanzoff range of the Brooks Range. And then we thought we'd take this little divide between the Jago River and the Achillik River. Now, this is just one small section of a very huge Arctic coastal plain. But crossing across here, drop down, and then run up the Achillik River, because just looking at the map, it looked like it would be an easier crossing significantly. This is one of the lower passes through the heart of the Brooks Range, so up around 5,000 feet at the Continental Divide here. Now, the problem was the best maps that we had a contour interval of about 80 feet. And what that means is, this is a much larger scale map. We had lots of good maps with us. But the best maps that we had wouldn't show an 80-foot cliff. The gap between the lines on the topographic map were about 80 feet. So we weren't sure what we'd encounter up in these steeper sections, particularly the drop down to the south side of the range. But our plan was to come down this little drainage, drop into the Sheenjack River Valley, and get picked up on a big gravel bar along this river in the Sheenjack. So we spied the landing zone on the way in. This is my buddy Mike and Mike Collins and his son Nathan. Just the three of us were on that trip together. That's a shot up close to the Continental Divide. This is our bush pilot. He was literally, a bit of a cross between Indiana Jones and a pilot, and he runs Yukon Air Service out of Arctic Circle. Great guy, Kurt. And so he flew us in there, dropped us off. There's the little Bitley Mountain, and you're standing there facing the Brooks Range. And I was probably starting out because I had camera gear. I had a reasonable Gitzo carbon fiber tripod with a ball head, and I was in that transition zone between film and digital. So I had my Nikon D200, but I didn't trust an electronic camera like that. So I was also carrying my Nikon FM3A and a whole bunch of rolls of Fuji Velvia, and trading lenses between those two cameras. So, this was the days of digital where 12 megapixels was my maximum resolution. And this is one of my early panoramic mergers. I set it up on the tripod with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens and showed the Arctic coastal plain with the north side of the Brooks Range, zoomed in on it a bit, and then shot overlapping frames of these beautiful clouds with a bit of light. And I took a 12 megapixel image and turned it into about 70 megapixels. And this is, where I really started figuring out, wow, you can print so much bigger. You can just get such higher quality by sweeping the sensor through the scene. Plus, you get that kind of distance compression that you get with a telephoto lens with a wide angle scene. Just fun stuff that's not possible any other way. So as we started walking, a few things became really clear. There were tons and tons of wildlife. The caribou were migrating into the coastal plain for their summer breeding ground. There were bears out there. We ran into a female grizzly not long out of the bat. This is a shot with a 200 millimeter lens, and I probably over enlarged it a little bit, but we were moving through willows and suddenly saw a pile of brown fur, and I will say we backed away very carefully. And we were well prepared. We had, my friend Mike had a big canister of bear spray. Nathan had an air horn, like a boat air horn, on his hip. And I had a pistol just to make shots in the air to scare it away. The bears up there are notoriously unafraid of humans. They don't run into humans. This entire trip, we didn't see any other humans. And there were lots of small little ground squirrels. Every camp we made, they were checking out what food might be available and popping up around us. Not terribly afraid. And you had to watch your step because there were birds' nests and birds everywhere, and lots of ground birds' nests. And the terrain was complicated. As you're walking along, there's so much of this just sort of, unfrozen tundra, sprouting grassy tussocks, moss, puddles, these wetlands that you have to kind of mush your way through, where the ground is almost like a sponge and super uneven and complicated to walk on. It got really arduous really fast, especially with heavy packs. I would say I probably started out with about gosh, 80, 85 pounds on my back, and my friends were much lighter, but you'll see as we go through the slideshow, we sort of traded positions on weight. I'll explain it in a minute. But here's the Jago River running up towards the Brooks Range, all kinds of lichen on the rocks. We actually would put our food out on these gravel bars in the middle of the river. We'd wait out and put our food out there, and we'd eat about 100 yards from camp and then set up camp away from the food, just because the grizzly situation had us all thinking about them all the time. You'd come upon these places where you could see that grizzly bears had just torn the ground apart looking for ground squirrels. Lots of evidence of life and death through these just beautiful sort of high. It feels like an alpine kind of desert, but it's in parts, where there was a little less water, but with that nearly 24 hours of sun, well, it really is 24 hours of sunshine. That was one of the weird things, was trying to sleep when the sun is up. The sun just kind of goes in a circle around you, and at about 1 o'clock in the morning it gets close to the horizon and the light got a little bit nice, but for the most part it was pretty bright light all the time. But you can tell that there's life everywhere, and there's lots going on out there with predation and wolves and bears, but it's just kind of an incredible otherworldly scene. Not having any trails, not having any roads, not having any air traffic that you can see up above, just no people. Just you have entered the food chain. It's a different kind of feeling hiking in a place quite this wild. There's no signs or trails. So we cut across towards the Achillik River from the Jago, and we went up this little pass, and it was amazing how in this thawed out tundra, there's these just grooves in the ground from generation after generation of caribou coming through these passes on their way into the coastal plain. We had timed it. We wanted to see, the thousands and thousands of caribou flooding through the passes. But unfortunately, that year there was a late spring heavy snowstorm in the Brooks Range on the south side, and a lot of the caribou calved on the other side, and so they came through a little bit late. But we did see advanced groups, and we saw quite a few caribou, but not the thousands that we were hoping for. It was just one of those years where the timing didn't work. But I love in this image the texture of it, because of the way that the ground is carved by these generations of caribou running through the pass, and then up above the sky was just mirroring it. And you got these crazy weathered limestone peaks in this little area as you came across. I just thought that the lichen on the rocks and these constant reminders of, here's a doll sheep skull, and this just gorgeous rock with the Brooks Range back behind. And we had a constant bunch of different interesting textured marine layer clouds that kept coming through. Sometimes, I growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I'm so used to this. Sometimes you'd have these just marine layers floating in, and it would just be that kind of low overcast. I told you that my pack got lighter while my friends' packs got heavier. These days I would hope I'd get this a little bit sharper, but it's been a number of years ago, so I'll forgive myself. But here's my buddy Mike. He's such a naturalist. He was reading a book about the life cycle of the lobster as we were doing this trip. I had like a World War II spy novel, and he was reading about lobsters, and he kept collecting skulls, bones, antlers, rocks, everything of interest to him. He's like, oh, I gotta take this home with me. And his pack kept getting heavier and heavier, and his son was helping him carry stuff. But it was just such a dramatic landscape that we're hiking through it, and Mike's pack just kept getting, as I said, heavier and heavier. As I was eating my pack away, Mike was just adding to his. I love this shot of this ptarmigan. I usually try to avoid shots of birds' butts and kind of joke about people's photos of birds' butts and critiques, but I couldn't get this ptarmigan to turn around. And I the interesting thing about this is, how in the wintertime the ptarmigans are pure white, so they're camouflaged and blend in the snow. This is Alaska's state bird. And then in the summer, they turn into a brown feather scheme that helps camouflage them against the tundra. But it's interesting that all the female ptarmigan that we ran into had fully changed color for the summer months, and the males were still just slowly changing from white. And that's actually an evolutionary adaptation where the males are more prey while the females are so much more important as they tend the nest. So the males change a little bit later and get eaten at a higher rate, while the females do that important job of making sure that the eggs hatch. This is the one night up in this little valley. We were in this high valley where we camped as we came across the pass from the Shinjak from the Jago to the Achillik. And actually, got out of the tent at like 1 o'clock in the morning and saw the sun a little bit low. So this is the middle of the night. And this valley, we called it Wolf Valley because there was just signs of wolf kill everywhere, wolf tracks. And as we came down out of that valley into the Achillik River, we got into a bunch of Alphice, which you can see these layered deposits from year after year of ice accumulation and the river breaking it into big blocks. And it was actually easier to walk on. I'm standing right on the edge of one of these blocks that's broken and tumbling down into the river below. I threw Mike out there for just a little bit of scale because I don't think you'd have any sense of the size of this unless you have a human in there. But it was just good quality, easy walking on this off-ice after we'd been in the tundra for so long. And as we went up the Achillik and it got a little smaller as we're heading up into the mountains, I noticed that there were these birds visiting these rocks. And I climbed up, and without touching the nest or disturbing it, I just couldn't believe how many baby shrikes were in this nest. These are some fierce hunting birds. Shrikes, you should look them up if you're curious, but there's 7 of these babies in this nest just crammed in there up on this high rock precipice. And there were so many birds there for the summer breeding season. It was just amazing. So a great little anecdote: while we were coming along this river, we kept coming to these cliffy sections, and we'd have to go up on the canyon walls, and then drop back down, and then up on the canyon walls. Oh, and here, a little aside, come back to my story, but you can see I used a graduated neutral density filter here, and this is the reason why I no longer use graduated neutral density filters in the field. Sure, it held back the sky, but it's also darkening the mountains, and this is a film shot on Velvia, so there's just no recovering those shadows. In the age of digital, you can do some work to get those shadows back, but I'd so much just rather shoot a series of bracketed images 2 to 3 stops apart depending on your sensor's capabilities and just blend those in post-production because it's just so much easier to save all the detail and not have these weird lines forced on the landscape of darkness, where you put a dark piece of glass just across the top, because it's very rare that in nature you get straight lines of contrast. Anywho, so moving up and down on these little canyon walls, and we were just exhausted. We had so much weight. We'd hike for an hour and a half, and I remember at this point I was realizing kind of where my rations were. I'd have a handful of nuts every 30 minutes, and I'd eat a Starburst every hour. I had it sort of figured out. 2 weeks I can maintain that without running out of these little treats that keep me going. And every couple hours we'd just lay down and take a 5-minute power nap, with the packs off. And we were getting ready to take one of those little power naps, and I looked out down the river, and there was this grizzly bear coming along the other side, snuffling along, maybe looking for ground squirrels or something on the other side of the river coming towards me. And the wind was blowing straight from this bear towards me downriver. I was across the way. The longest lens I had was a 70 to 200 old push-pull from the film days Nikon Zoom, and I dashed over to the place where the canyon was the narrowest, and I'd be as close to the other side as possible. And I crouched down and got my elbows on my knees and steadied myself so I could get a nice shot. Zoomed all the way out, and this bear came snuffling along, and it just had its head down. It was like sniffing through the grass, and I thought this rock was a really cool feature. And so the moment it got near that rock, I yelled, "Hey!" And the bear looked up, and I got my shot. And then the second shot, the bear is aggressively moving down the mountain to come and eat me, essentially. And it's only about 40 feet down to the water and maybe 10 feet across the river and 30, 40 feet up to me, which seemed safe when I yelled, hey. But it was evident to me that the bear was going to be to me before I could ever get back to my pack and my friends that I'd left, 20 yards up the trail. And I stood up and I turned and looked back towards my pack, and where my pistol was, and my friend Nathan was running towards me with the pistol in one hand and the bear spray in the other, and the bear got almost to the water and looked up and realized that there were two of us and that we were bigger than it had seemed, because I had been really crouched down to try to brace with my elbows on my knees. And when it saw there were two of us, that we weren't running away and that we were bigger than it thought, it spun around and just disappeared up these rocks in an instant. And it definitely was impressive to me. I will have greater respect for grizzly bears ever after. I was a little bit younger. There's no great excuse, but now as a dad, I would definitely never do that again. So we kept going up the river higher and higher. We got into some sections where the snow was relatively deep and there was no way around it. And we did some horrible post-holing where it got cold. And you'll notice that back behind us, this is a little more than a marine layer building to the north of the mountains, which was getting a little bit concerning to us. It was a little bit ominous. We came upon a light plane crash. It was clear that they'd taken the body out. It was also clear that nobody survived this plane crash. And we looked into it later, and sure enough, it had been a hunter who'd perished in this crash. But we kind of looked through it for a minute, and then we got up to the Continental Divide. And believe it or not, yes, that's a clean-shaven Hudson with short hair. 13 years ago, my buddy Mike and Nathan. And that's where things got a little bit dicey. We started, the weather had set in. It was a thicker weather. It was starting to feel like it was going to potentially rain. And we started down the south side, and it was steep and very treacherous terrain, really loose rock, steep. And that's where those 80-foot contour intervals on our 1 to 24,000 maps really started to wreak havoc with us. We kept coming to little waterfalls where there were slick, icy rock walls and not easy ways around them. And we had been moving for about, 12, 13 hours at this point. It was getting to be 9 o'clock at night. It doesn't look like it, but we're up in the Arctic here. And I remember just this disheartening moment, where there's no way, as exhausted as we are, we're going to be able to rock climb around this waterfall that we'd come to. And I remember sort of thinking, sitting down and just thinking that you feel sort of doomed. There's no place to camp. There's no place to get warm. There's no place to cook dinner. And I remember, and the weather is getting worse. And I remember looking and thinking, there's no way that the caribou are crossing this way. There has to be a better way. The caribou have another way through here. And I remember looking up on one of these ridges and seeing a caribou trail running around along it, the ridge that up above this slope. And with some convincing, I convinced Mike and Nathan that we needed to climb up from the river to that caribou trail. And as we climbed up, we came to this big, beautiful, flat ledge right along a caribou trail heading north-south. And I said, we got to follow this trail. The caribou aren't taking cliffs and going over waterfalls. But we had this nice flat ledge, and we set up camp. It was about, I'm going to say it was like 15 hours from when we'd started the day before. And we set up camp, and we cooked dinner and went to sleep and slept for, a good 8-9 hours. We got up the next day, and the next day was actually the hardest day of the whole trip because, we followed the caribou trail, but we also ran into all kinds of hardship and complicated terrain. And we wound up just kind of having to cross these raging little streams on slick boulders over and over and over and climb along kind of manky snow and ice along these just steep, loose, rotten rock terrain. And we were in the stream more than out of it. Our feet were just completely soaked. You can kind of see from Mike's face how we felt. And it was another long, arduous trip. Still noticing beauty all the way along. There's, so much beauty to photograph. But eventually we found a way down. It was raining. It was miserable. And we hit the Shinjek Valley. And got a place set up tents in the rain. I remember we were crossing this little stream to get to a place where we could camp right when we came down out of the mountain, and Mike got rolled in the stream and went completely under, and we had to kind of fish him out, and he was soaked to the bone, and it was cold and raining, and we got camp set up, and being on the correct side of the river, looking at the maps, knowing that we kind of had it made from here on out, that's where I changed out of my first set of clothes. I have one clean spare set of clothes, and so here you can see stuff laid out the next day, airing out a bit. I had a few little antlers that I loved, and a doll sheep skull, and this one cool caribou antler that looked like some kind of Klingon weapon from Star Trek or something. And so I still have these things on my bookcase at home, but I used this to dry socks and sock liners. It was really nice to change clothes. It had been, I don't know, 10 days maybe in these clothes. And I remember, I was kind of cleaning my camera gear, and I had my antler set on the ground next to me while cooking breakfast the next morning, and this just beautiful old world swallowtail butterfly landed on this antler right as I was cleaning my 55 millimeter old Nikon 2.8 macro lens. And it was like click, snap. It's just so fun when things kind of happen perfectly like that. And I will say the last few days of walking along the Shinjek Valley were just spectacular. It felt like the high moors or something, and there were these limestone weathered peaks that were just incredible, and we had cool weather that was kind of in and out, rays of light playing across the ridges, rainbows, and the landscape's just so big. This dry river valley. We found this spring that was bubbling up along the edge of it that had the best tasting water I think I've ever tasted in my entire life. The Shinjek Valley has just been picked completely clean by the caribou. They winter over on this side of the mountains, and they eat every blade of grass. But these little flowers, these little purple flowers, were blooming across it, and these storms were rolling through, and it was just really spectacular. And then we got to the little strip, and at the appointed hour, our guy Kurt was there to pick us up, and he was a little shocked at how heavy we were because of all the little things that we collected. But we had a little bit of a scary takeoff because we were heavy and there were crosswinds. And I will say I was sitting up in the front of the plane with the view out, and it was one of the scarier takeoffs that I've ever been a part of. But we got up in the sky and we headed home. And I will say that, if you want a big adventure, I've been a lot of wild places in the world, and I don't think that there's any place wilder than the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It was really, really an incredible trip, and it's one that when my kids get a little bigger, I would love to go back. I don't know that I'd cross the mountains with them, but I'd love to go back to some spots and spend some time in this great wilderness. And I hope, I have quite a bit of faith that there's not as much oil as they think under the coastal plain, and I really hope that they don't cover it with roads and pumping stations and runways and gravel quarries. So we'll kind of watch what happens with that, and my fingers are crossed that it can stay as wild as possible. Well, hey everybody, thanks so much for watching that. It's a really, really special place to me. I'm watching anxiously to see what happens there, and my hope is that some of the experts are right. There's not that much oil there, and that the politics change and it stays protected going on into perpetuity. I'd like my children and grandchildren to be able to have an adventure like that in our own country. So hey, everyone, thanks so much for the support of the channel. Thanks for liking, thanks for subscribing and sharing these videos with your friends. It means a lot to me. I will be back in early October. If you have comments, if you have questions, go ahead, leave them down below the YouTube channel, or you can always email me. I'm easy to reach. This whole thing is a conversation, so it needs your voice. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.